Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today for the second class of the ABC of Contemporary Capital with David Harvey, hosted by the People's Forum. To ground us today in class 2, I wanted to share that the People's Forum is a political education space. We are a cultural center for working class internationalist movement building. You are here live streaming and seeing us here on the YouTube, but we're a physical space in New York City. So come check out the books that we have, our cafe, the public events that we host, book talks, lectures, and also the slew of other events, talks, and lectures that we have on our YouTube channel. And our political education classes, all available online. I wanted to do a short little introduction of David Harvey since we didn't do that last week. David Harvey is a distinguished professor of anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He has written extensively on the political economy of globalization, urbanization, and cultural change. His recent books include 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism and the Ways of the World. He contributed the foreword to the Pluto Press edition of the Communist Manifesto. And David Harvey has been teaching Karl Marx's Capital for over 40 years, including here at the People's Forum. If you are following online, materials are available on davidharvey.org following every class. The other classes are also here on our YouTube playlist. And as you're listening along, please feel free to use the YouTube chat to ask questions. And then we'll also try to address things after the lecture as well. And with that, I will pass it over. Thank you.
Okay. We're all ready?
We are all ready.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for coming. And I had suggested last week, and I'm going to try and see how it works this week. But what I wanted to do was to spend the first, 20 minutes, half an hour of the class discussing the written materials that we worked on last week. I presented them, and the written version is on the web, and I suggested you go look at it and you work out some of your ideas you might have about it or questions you might have about it, and we could have a sort of brief discussion. As you know, these materials dealt with the idea of the mission statement and how about to go about fulfilling that mission statement. And I sort of suggested that we needed to look at capital in terms of this idea of totality. And this idea of totality is, I think, rather important to this class. Marx himself uses it a lot in the Grundrisse, but tends to sort of downplay it elsewhere. And it has been somewhat downplayed in the literature about Marx, but I'm sort of putting it up front because it seems to me that there are a number of circulation processes that we can look at within what capital is about. And there is a way of understanding what I call the inner structure and the general framework. And the language Marx uses to talk about the capitalist mode of production, which is an analysis of the inner structure of the main powerful elements that are forcing capital to change and develop and expand and become a spiral and all those kinds of things. There's a difference between that and the whole world of what capital is about, in other words, the context. And so that distinction between the inner structure and, if you like, the fuzzier outer boroughs of what capital is about creates the focus for the class. So I'm mainly going to be talking about the inner structure, and it's the inner structure that concerns me. But you can't talk about the inner structure without actually setting up the context. And I use some analogies about the human body and health and all those kinds of things to try to illustrate what I was talking about. Now, maybe there are some people who've got some questions and observations they want to make about this. So I'm just going to sort of leave it to you, and let's get you to sort of make some comments on last week's reading and last week's presentation. So let me stop here and just turn it over to the class for people to volunteer, and please feel free to say whatever you feel like saying about any of this stuff. So who would like to take a crack?
Go ahead, Tanzo.
Yeah, Tanzo? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for this, Professor Harvey. So I guess one of the things that I spent some time thinking about was the discussion around totality, the discussion distinguishing between capital and its inner logic. It's the essential character of capital, and then capitalism as a social formation, something which is historically located, and that the difference there also seems to be one of abstraction, right? So yes. Capital is what you're trying to do there is theorize at a conceptual level to identify common elements of different social formations of capitalism, which are all revolve around production, circulation, realization, etc., etc. So I think because I don't know, there were points where and so totality captures the understanding of capital at its kind of abstract inner logic, rather than thinking of totality as a social formation, so including not just the inner logic, but also the kind of superstructure, the political context and whatever. So, I mean, I guess one thing that might be useful to think about is why is that level of abstraction, to just look at the inner logic, important? Even though you recognize the significance of capitalism as a social formation, and does anything get lost in that level of abstraction by just looking at the inner logic? Of course, we've got to define what the essence of capital is, but does anything get lost in that level of abstraction? And if it does, maybe something could be said about that, if I'm making any sense.
No, I think you're right. I mean, the short answer is that something is lost and something's gained, and you have to balance that. I mean, clearly, if I just stuck with the inner structure and didn't want to have anything to say about, the relation to nature or human culture or anything like that, it would be, it would be a real loss. And to some degree, by concentrating on the inner structure, there is a loss. But on the other hand, I get to understand the inner structure better. And by understanding the inner structure better, I can deal with certain of the things that are created out of that inner structure, like crises. And I want to interpret what happened in 2007, 2008. How can I do that? And how So yes, something's lost and something's gained. And I think the analogy I used, and I'll go back to that because I used it in the text, is to say, if I'm a doctor and I'm looking at a patient and I'm looking at their heart system because they've got a problem with their heart system, then I'm going to concentrate all of my attention on the dynamics of what goes on within the heart system. I'm not going to be thinking, about the everything else that's going on in the human body. And I certainly won't be thinking about whether they took opioids or something of that kind. So by specializing, if you like, and getting down, the heart surgeon could get and do the stuff that has to be done about the heart, by isolating it, if you like, from all of the surrounding forces. But if somebody comes along and says the only thing that matters is your heart, and forget about the social anomie and the frustrations and alienations and the stresses of contemporary society and so on, yeah, well, you lose all that. But then there's a point where the heart surgeon doesn't want to be thinking about all of that while they're fiddling around with giving you a heart bypass or whatever. So yes, you're right. But I think that one of the things there you would have to recognize is that the definition of the boundaries of the totality for a particular operation is very important. And you know that in a way they're artificial boundaries. And I don't know where you are in your studies, but if you have to write a thesis, you're going to focus on something, and then you're going to hit something, and something's going to say, no, I can't deal with that. It's outside. It's in the social formation, if you want to call it that. And so yes, I think there is something that's lost, but at the same time, something is gained because you understand what Marx calls the laws of motion that come out of the inner structure and which have incredible effects on social life everywhere. So that's the way I would set this up. So the totality is a device, and yes, it's an abstraction, and you put artificial boundaries around it. And sometimes the boundaries sort of define themselves, like the boundary around the human body is self-definitional in a way, but then you're kind of saying, how does this organism fit in the general structure of organisms all over the place? So you have that, but yes, I think this is right. But so that then modifies very much the kinds of claims you would want to make. See, I'm not going to make the claim, and I hope you wouldn't go on to make the claim, that everything that you need to know is defined by what's going on in the inner structure. No, absolutely not. But if you don't know what's going on in the inner structure, you see all these other things going on, you say, why the hell is that happening? And at that point, you can go back and something's going on in the inner structure, which is going to explain what is going on in the surface and what's going on in the social formation. So that's the way in which we should think about it. I don't know if that helps. But I think it's a very good point, and it's a very good question. And part of the problem is that, a lot of people, when they focus on the inner structure, become so wound up with the inner structure that nothing else matters. And I don't want to get into that, but I want to take care of the inner structure at the same time.
Open up to response, and then Michelle. Great, go ahead, Michelle.
Well, I guess this is a little bit of a response to that. Professor Harvey, you mentioned wanting to understand crisis, and I was interested in the text and by looking at the inner structure, do you think that'll help you be able to understand or better explain crisis? But I was really interested in the mention of the role in crisis and the renewal of capital. And it sounds like your emphasis or your intention is to focus on the inner structure in order to better understand why that happens. And I think I could be wrong, but it seems to me like we've seen, at least in the 20th century, multiple moments of crisis in which the renewal of capital went, to maybe deepen these structures or further these structures rather than to open up alternatives, as is also mentioned in your text. And so I think there I'm curious to know if that's why you're interested in looking at the role of the state, and if you think that at least that processes or that part of the social is as important to look at as this inner structure. And so, I guess I'm curious to know about the role of crisis in the renewal of capital, and also I guess looking forward to us taking a look at some of those social processes about the state that may have this interplay in the totality or in the inner structure.
Yeah, well, my hope is that by the time we get to the end of the class, we will have enough understanding about the inner structure and a lot of understanding of its contextual conditions, that we will be able to respond to events going on around us in ways that says, well, this is happening because of these forces which are at work. And we start to think about where those forces get blocked and where those forces get unleashed, and that we'll have a better understanding. Now, it's very difficult at the beginning to give it the answer of what it looks like at the end. And I understand, you know, you want to get to the end. But my hope is that by in a sense, looking at these different circulation processes, so far we haven't looked at any of them. We've just looked at generally at the fact that there are circulation processes. There are 7 of them as identified, which are actually at work within the totality, and which constitute the inner structure. But I haven't actually looked at any one of those circulation processes. I'm going to look at one of them today. But then I hope that by the time we've looked at all of them, you'll start to be able to say, well, you know, if this economy is sick, it'll be a bit like, you know, again, the medical analogy is sort of, if this person is sick, then where's the sickness coming from? What's the underlying cause? And, you know, there's all sorts of strange things happen. People get referred pain. People have, I don't know, pain in their back or in their chest. And it turns out that it has something to do with, you know, a pinched nerve in their leg or something, you know. So exactly, you know, so when we're going to analyze what is going on around us right now, and this is why I want to call this about contemporary capitalism, you know, to try to identify what are the problems in contemporary capitalism now. What are the circulation processes in contemporary capitalism which lie at the root of some of our dilemmas? Just to jump ahead, if you like, for instance, why is it that economically, and it's not simply politically, but economically, it is so difficult for our society to actually confront and deal with climate change? You know, it's all very well to say, well, I know there are people that deny us, and then there's the fossil fuel industry and all of that kind of thing. But even with the best will in the world, and imagining that all of those blockages were not there, there would still be a very serious problem of how capitalist society can confront the question of climate change, for example. So this is just just giving you one example of where I would want to go with this. So that we don't get into the idea that somehow or other, oh, if only you know, BP and Exxon would stop doing the messing around the way they are, everything would be all right. No, there's something very serious about the inner structure of capitalism that is perpetually driving onwards and upwards, as it were, in a spiral form, which is actually putting that pressure on environmental aggregates, both in terms of supply, that is the destruction of habitats, extractivism and mining, and then the effects in terms of climate change. So if we want to get to that sort of understanding, then this is one of the things that I would try to dissect by looking more carefully at the inner structure of capitalism, to ask the question, to what degree is the inner structure of capitalism responsible for the kinds of dilemmas we're facing when we're looking for policies to deal with climate change? That's kind of where I want to go. If I can get there. I'm not promising you I'm going to get there, because I may not. But this is where I think we should be trying to go.
You can go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Towards the end of the first week's writing, you give the definition of value, of surplus value, as the labor, what I understand to be like a labor theory of value, which, and you say like that that this definition needs to be taken at this point on faith, and I appreciate that, and partly because when I first read Capital in a kind of outside of a classroom, was the first time I read it, and that was the thing that I found most was the easiest thing to take on faith, because it just made so much sense. Like this idea of human labor creating value that was then exploited, the way that it is described. It took me a while to grasp the concept, but when I grasped it, it just made a lot of sense. And then I'm a student in the history department, and so the other big idea that I sort of glom onto in your article here, the writing that you shared, is the idea of historical materialism, or what is I've heard called like dialectical materialism, in the sort of Hegel connection. But of course, in economics, the labor theory of value is not necessarily what economists are focused on at this point. And in history, studying history, historical materialism is not what we're being taught in the history department. And it seems to me that you're trying to bring together these two strands that have been largely treated separately. And I'm just wondering if I'm reading you correctly.
Yeah, this is a tricky one for obvious reasons. Marx does start off by kind of accepting the general framework of a labor theory of value as it came down from classical political economy. But then, typical Marx, he starts to, change it, revolutionize it, if you like. So the value theory that you encounter on the first few pages of Capital is completely different from where you end up at the end of the. And it's interesting in some ways. For instance, the idea that value is labor time. Well, that was something that was there in Ricardo, and to some degree and was a bit in Adam Smith as well. And it was certainly followed by the Ricardians. But what Marx said is it's not labor time, it's socially necessary labor time. So then the interesting question is not about the labor time, it's about, well, what's socially necessary labor time? And socially necessary labor time suggests that there is a category called socially unnecessary labor time. That is, labor which isn't producing anything, which I got to a little bit last time by sort of talking about, well, what is productive labor? Right? That productive labor is the labor which is producing surplus value for the capitalist. And that to be a productive laborer is therefore a misfortune, because you're producing the existence of somebody else. And that is in effect what the laborer does. The laborer produces capital by producing surplus value. And since surplus value defines the capitalist, the laborer is actually producing the capitalist. So this is where the labor theory of value starts to go with Marx. And there's a very interesting book or article by Diane Elson, which I use a lot, and you may look at it if you can. And it's called The Value Theory of Labor, rather than the labor theory of value. And in a sense, you see, what the labor theory of value always posed a problem for Ricardo and so on was the following: that if labor constitutes value, how come labor receives so very little of it? You know, I mean, where did that come from, and how to understand it? And what Diane Nelson does is to take that and then kind of say, well, really, we're looking at how capital values labor. And so it's not a value that I would have, or probably you would have, or anybody else would have. It's how capital values labor. And capital values labor because labor produces surplus value. So the human labor, which is actually embodied in commodities, embodies that contradiction. So this is where it's going, and actually part of the problem in Marx's Capital is you never actually get to the end of that story. You keep on finding that your notion of value is shifting a little bit because he's done this and that and this, and you know. But it is an abstraction, and as I mentioned, it's you know, a lot of people kind of just dismiss it. But I then kind of say, well, you know, if you dismiss concepts of this kind, and you know, like for example, power. I mentioned power, and I kind of said, you know, how do we measure Donald Trump's power? And when it can, do we have gadgets of power or something? You know, what we can't do it. But we know it's there because, you know, we see what's happening with it. So there are a lot of concepts like this, which Marx kind of says they're immaterial but objective. That is, you can't see them, and you know, you can't, you know, pick up Donald Trump and dissect his brain and find out how much power there is in there. You can't do that. And you can't take a stone and measure how much gravity is in there. It's a relation. So what Marx is saying is we're going to have one of these concepts, and it's a key concept, and it's immaterial but objective. Now, that is a very strange formulation for many people, because Marx is always seen as a materialist. And he is a historical materialist. But he has these concepts like value, which are immaterial but objective. And then people say, well, how can he possibly have a concept like that? Because he's a materialist, you know. But the fact is that materialist science has all kinds of concepts of this kind as well, it turns out. If you go off and read about quantum mechanics, you find all kinds of weird things of this sort, you know. So you know, it's not as if Marx is talking about something which is kind of so alien that it's outside of all possible manner of thinking. But the starting point is, all right, page 1, we'll accept time for the time being, sort of Ricardo, but I'm going to put this socially necessary concept on it, and I'm going to elaborate on it as we go on further and further down the line.
Feel free to just come off of mute. No need to raise hand, and if you have questions and responses.
Everybody else happy with the concepts? Everybody clear about this concept of the totality? I mean, it is, you know, we define the totality in a way. It's a mental conception, but there's also a real thing which can be conceptualized as a totality.
Can I ask a question about the Hegelian conception of the totality? I feel like it's kind of implied in the text, in contrast to I guess Marx, but could you elaborate? I'm not familiar.
Well, I'm not very, you know, I'm not very well read in Hegel, and I just noted that people were kind of who were working in the Hegelian tradition were using the concept of totality, and people found that it didn't work. And so there was a sort of debate amongst Lukács and others about, why it didn't work. And the answer seemed to be that it was had this sort of rather closed character to it. The concept of totality that I'm working with, as I suggested, is ecosystemic. It's like an ecosystem, and like any ecosystem, it's sort of open to influences from outside, but it has a great deal of inner complexity, which is not settled. In other words, there's unsettling contradictory relations within the totality. So if you're interested in the kind of question of Hegelian notion of totality, please don't ask me, because I'm not an expert on it. I tend to avoid getting tangled up in the sort of the Hegel debates, which is probably something I shouldn't do. But I kind of, and I'm very well aware of Lenin's stricture that you can't really understand Marx's Capital without reading Hegel's logic. Well, I tried to read Hegel's logic once and didn't get too far with it. But there's a lot of scholarship, of course, in terms of Marx and Hegel. And I'm afraid you'll have to find an answer to that question elsewhere. I'm going to just simply say that my impression is that the Hegelian concept of totality is far too closed and not open and dynamic enough to be able to capture the circulation processes which I'm going to be looking at. I've characterized, and some people have been rather annoyed at me for this, so you should know this. I made the kind of comment that I thought the Grundrisse was Marx trying to emancipate himself from the thought of Ricardo and from the thought of Hegel. A lot of people didn't take nicely to that because in many ways there is a Hegelian reading of the Grundrisse which is a very strong and powerful one, but I'm doing a political economic reading, and the notion of totality in the Grundrisse appears to me to be much more of this organic sort and ecosystemic sort. And I often wonder what Marx would have done had he actually read the kind of seminal essays that were written during his lifetime about ecology, because I'm really talking about capital as an ecosystem, and that's my totality. And I know there's going to be a lot of Hegelian blowback on that conception, but there we are. But you've read some Negri and so on, which in some ways would be taking things up in that way, right?
I'm not sure.
Any other kind of comments people want to make?
We have something from the live stream that I'll share. You write that features in capital circulation crystallize and become inhibitory, and that humanity strains against this rigidity. Why does a dynamic system become so rigid?
The simplest answer in a political sense is because of vested interests. You look at something like the power of the energy lobby. Okay, they've monopolized a great deal of power, and they're very strong. And they have been immovable in many respects in terms of responding to environmental issues and also responding to economic issues. For instance, there is a huge concentration of, massive concentration and centralization of wealth and power. And one of the things you find, and it's a general rule, is that people who have a lot of wealth and power are not willingly going to give it up. And so you get what Cedric Robinson called arrested development. That is, people block changes. I mean, right now in the United States, it would seem to me that the power of the oligarchy, if you want to call it that, people like Peter Thiel and the Koch brothers and all the other really wealthy people, their power is invested in creating gridlock in Washington, so state power cannot be used to address many of the problems that need to be addressed. So why does it become blocked? Well, it's because the class force becomes monopolized and it becomes factionalized, and the faction becomes dominant and refuses to make those changes which are necessary for the dynamism of the system. I mean, I'm not talking about going to socialism or anything like that. I'm just talking about the dynamism of the system, and therefore the centralization of power and how that centralization works is likely to be very hostile to the kinds of reforms which would be necessary to keep the whole system fluid and running. I mean, you look at this historically. The huge struggle that Marx records in the chapter on the working day over the limitation of the working day. And a huge struggle, took 20 years of struggle, workers organized. In the end, the aristocracy came on board because they disliked the industrialists. So the aristocracy supported the workers over the question of regulating the length of the working day. Now, the fact is that not regulating the length of the working day would create a situation in which capitalists would simply kill off their workers through overwork. So at some point or other, the thing is going really very badly and you need to change it, but the power relations are not there to actually implement the change. This frequently happens in the history of capital. Any other questions? If not, we'll go on to the next phase. These questions are great, so please try to imagine questions of this sort for next week and thereafter, and we can have discussions of these things. Okay, that would be really good. So thank you for your contributions. Those people who contributed, those people who have not contributed, please get in and contribute. Okay, so now we come to part 2 of this class, which is the session 2, and I have a paper which I'm going to read, and then we will put this paper on the web, and then we will open up discussion on it next time. There may be a brief time for discussion at the end. And session 2 is called The Circulation of Labor Capacity. Now, I just interject an editorial point. Marx began Capital with the concept of the commodity and worked on from there and the laborer doesn't enter into the picture of Capital until you're about page 200 or something like that. I'm going to start with labor capacity, the circulation of labor capacity, which is one of those circulation processes which I identified last time as being important within the capital as a totality. So here we go. The category of labor lies at the heart of Marx's analysis. Labour in itself is, of course, a category common to all modes of production. Historically, the organisation of labour in general, and of wage labour in particular, has taken on many forms. One of the historic presuppositions of capital, says Marx, and I'm quoting him, is free labour, exchangeable for money and separated from the means of labour and the material for labour. This presumes, and again I quote Marx, release of the worker from the soil as his natural workshop, hence dissolution of small free-landed property, as well as the communal land ownership resting on the Oriental commune. In prior forms, and I quote, the natural unity of labour with its material is achieved, and the individual relates to himself as proprietor, as master of the conditions of his reality. This is from the Grundrisse. In the relation established under the rule of capital, however, labour is alienated in its relation to itself. It does not control its labour process or its product. It is also alienated in its relation to nature, because capital deploys wage labour so that the metabolic relation to nature becomes a purely objective value for purposes of production. The rise of industrial capital was predicated upon the dissolution or transcendence of former conditions of labour. It entailed the creation of a distinctive mode of circulation of labour capacity that integrates with and supports the requirements of capital accumulation. These two circulation processes of capital and labour capacity intersect and collide at a key moment to produce value and surplus value within the totality that is capital. The free labour that capital requires has to be free in a double sense, that unlike slave, serf, or indentured labour, it is free to offer its capacity to labour to whomsoever it chooses, while being simultaneously freed from any access whatsoever to any means of production that might permit it to produce its own sustenance on its own account. In other words, there had to be a labour force that had no option but to offer its capacity to labour to buyers in order to survive. In its prior existence, such a labour force exchanged its capacity to labour against revenues of the state, the church, the feudal lords, or in the military. The existence of a labour market was a necessary precursor and precondition for the rise of industrial capital. Forms of employment in non-productive, that is, non-surplus value producing sectors, did not disappear with the emergence of industrial capital. Indeed, as the productivity of the labour force employed by industrial capital rose, so more and more workers were liberated to work in non-productive, non-surplus value producing forms of employment, such as services, state employment, the law, and the like. What all workers, both productive and unproductive, have in common is that their capacity to work belongs to the buyer during the hours of contract. That contract is a legal expression of the class relation between employer, capital, and employee, labour. How this class relation was and is used by industrial capital is the crucial story. With the rapid growth of industrial capital, the latter had to ensure continuous growth in labour supply through, for example, population growth, the forced eviction of rural populations from off the land, the proletarianization of professional layers and middle classes, as well as mobilizing colonized peoples and migration. What Marx calls the emergence of capital out of money is the originary moment for capital. This moment rests on the ability of the capitalist to find upon the market a commodity capable of creating more value than it itself has. That commodity is labour power, the capacity to labour. Labour power is, and I quote Marx, the form giving fire out of which capital is forged through surplus value production. The capacity to labour is not innate, It is learned and passed on from generation to generation. Knowledge of labor processes is accumulated, internalized, documented, and diffused across social groups. Capital appropriates all of this as if it has the sole right to the proprietary knowledge that is embodied in the very being of the laborer. Some pre-capitalist forms of knowledge are key use values that capital can and does appropriate, while others are discarded in some instances prematurely, as turned out to be the case of indigenous knowledges of medicinal uses of local plants. I here insert a little sidebar. For example, the plantation owners in the Carolinas were much admired in the late 18th and early 19th century for their innovations in developing tidal rice production. They developed a strong commercial agriculture based, to be sure, in slave labor. But it was later showed that it was the African slaves themselves who brought the techniques and knowledge of tidal rice production from West Africa, where it had been previously well developed. The slaves continued to manage the process throughout. The only innovation actually attributable to the plantation owners was to substitute commercial white rice for the non-commercial black rice used by the slave populations for their own sustenance. When living in Baltimore in the 1970s, I found African-American gardeners believed that seeds would only germinate around full moon. And I thought about this a long time until I read this about the rice production. So I later inferred that this was the universalization of a particular principle of seeding derived long ago from tidal rice production. Knowledge is all over the place. Who can appropriate it and where is one of the big issues in the past, and it continues to be so in the present. End of sidebar. Labor power is not a commodity like any other. It is not a product of human labor. Its value is set by the value of the commodities that the laborer needs to consume in order to survive. In the United States, the poverty level for a family of 4 is defined by the value of the market basket of commodities deemed necessary to survive at an adequate standard of living in a particular place and time. Amy Glassmeyer, who is at MIT, has recently developed a living wage calculator for localities in the United States, which includes the basic elements, and I'm quoting her, of a cost of living: housing, food, childcare, transportation costs, miscellaneous, which includes clothing as well as taxes. This is, she says, designed to be a minimum living wage that someone would need to be able to pay the basic expenses of their daily lives. In most instances, it turns out to be much higher than the existing minimum wage, but it also varies significantly from locality to locality. This is the sort of standard that Marx has in mind when thinking about the value of labor power, the basic wage rate. Marx recognizes that this value varies a great deal depending upon environmental and cultural conditions and the definition of necessities. For example, a cell phone became a necessity a few years back, while air conditioning is considered necessary in Texas, but not in Maine. Class struggles over the standard of living of labor affect the value of labor power, while, as Marx points out, a moral element often enters into its determination. Bourgeois reformers may seek to set up an adequate living standard for the working citizens of a particular state simply because living around chronic poverty is unpleasant and risky, because of the need also to build an adequate mass market for the commodities they produce. Statesmen also become aware that an exhausted, decrepit workforce was totally inadequate for military service. Fostering consent and keeping potential unrest under control have also been considerations. So the value of labor power in the Nordic countries is very different from that in China, Brazil, or the United States. It is very different between Alabama and Massachusetts. The definition of what constitutes a living wage is highly controversial. The value of labor power is, furthermore, sensitive to differentials in skills. Marx finesses this problem by suggesting that the value of skilled labor is some multiple of the value of ordinary unskilled labor. But, proposes Marx, for purposes of theorization and abstraction, we shall presume that the value of simple labor is fixed in a given place and time. This abstraction enables him to see more clearly where profit comes from. So we fix the value of labor power and then ask what forces rotate around it. The study of the circulation of labor capacity in relation to the circulation of industrial capital is as theoretically revealing as it is politically instructive. I sent out a little diagram to what this was about. The worker begins the day by entering a labor market as a seller of labor capacity in competition with other workers. If hired, a certain segment of the working population participates in a labor process of commodity production, designed and commanded by capital to yield value and surplus value. The worker's capacity is alienated in the sense that he or she has no effective control over the labor process or the nature and value of the commodity produced, all of which belong to capital. However, as recipient of a wage, the worker has discretionary freedom as to what to do with the money power. Some, if not all of that money power, has to be used to buy commodities in the market, both necessities in order to live and discretionary commodities that give pleasure. Any surplus may be saved for a rainy day, put by for old age, or frittered away in reckless consumption. Finally, the workers, armed with means of sustenance, participate in the complex processes of social reproduction of both themselves and of others, such as children dependent upon them. Together they live in a household, however defined, in a physical neighborhood. The qualities of daily life within that neighborhood world of social reproduction can vary substantially. These are the 5 key moments in the circulation of labor capacity. Begins with point of social reproduction, goes through the labor market, into the labor process, then becomes a money holder, then becomes a buyer of commodities, and takes those commodities back into social reproduction. This is the circulation process of labor capacity. When the industrial capitalist encounters the laborer as the bearer of labor power, the capitalist will offer a money wage in return for delivery of the capacity to labor. This money wage should be sufficient for the laborer to buy all those commodities needed to live at an adequate standard of living. In return for the money wage, the capitalist has the right to employ the capacity of labor for a given period of time, subject to contract negotiation, under capital's direction, in order to produce a new commodity for sale in the market. The capitalist also needs to buy means of production, raw materials, partially finished products, plant and equipment, tools and machinery, energy, etc. Adopting a particular regime of technology, an organizational form, such as the factory, the capitalist organizes the production of the new commodity, say a kitchen stove, on the presumption that someone will want to buy it for its use value, e.g. in cooking. The exchange value of the new commodity rests upon the past and present labor time congealed within it through production. From the standpoint of the market, this time is not the individual time of concrete labor in a particular production process. That is not what matters. What matters is the average time taken to produce a comparable product by all producers. This is what Marx calls the socially necessary labor time, abstract labor, embodied in the product, which often differs substantially from the concrete labor time actually expended by particular producers. This socially necessary labor time, abstract labor, is conceptualized as the value of the labor. This is the value that is realized in monetary form through a sale of the commodity in the market. The laborer produces the new value. The values of the inputs, the raw materials, the instruments of labor used up and partially finished products, etc., are preserved and transferred into the new commodity. Marx designates these elements as constant capital, just as little c. The laborer also adds value to the product by congealing the labor into the new commodity. How much value is added depends upon the hours worked. Capitalists know that they will have to pay a wage roughly equivalent to the value of labor power. The labor produces the equivalent of the value of labor power, designated by V, the variable capital, in, say, 6 hours of work. Once that requirement is covered, the capitalist can keep the labor working for, say, another 4 hours. This is the surplus value, designated by S, that underpins the money profit. The total value congealed in the product during the 10-hour day is designated as C, the constant capital, plus V, the variable capital spent on labor, plus S, the surplus value. Consider now some features of Marx's notation. The ratio S over V, surplus value of a variable capital, measures the rate of exploitation of labor power. The ratio C over V, variously called the organic or value composition of capital, is a measure of labor productivity or capital intensity. The ratio S over C plus V is a measure of the rate of profit, while C over S plus V captures the relation between past and present labor in production. Now, Marx will make much use of the movement of these ratios relative to each other, particularly in response to technological and organizational change, asking the question, for example, how does the rate of exploitation of labor power shift with technological change? How does the ratio C over V, the organic or value composition of capital, change with technological change? We will take up that issue next week. The procurement of surplus value profit is the be-all and end-all of the capitalist ambition. But it is labor power that adds the value and labor power that has the capacity to produce more value than it itself has. The capitalist merely captures and appropriates the surplus value that labor produces. The encounter between capital and labor is the inception point for the production of surplus value profit. It is, above all, the point where the persona of the industrial capitalist is produced. It is also the point where the circulation of capital and the circulation of labor capacity collide. In this accounting, everything depends upon the hours laborers work beyond that required to produce the value equivalent of their labor power. It is for this reason that struggles over the length of the working day, the working week, the working year, and the working life are foundational within bourgeois society, with major implications for the capitalist social formation, as well as for the theory of the capitalist mode of production. I note in passing, by the way, that the question of the length of the working day is scarcely ever mentioned in conventional economic theory. The struggle over the length of the working day, what Marx calls absolute surplus value, cannot be resolved by appeal to bourgeois property rights or law. As Marx puts it in Capital, the capitalist has the right to demand as much from the capacity to labor as possible. The laborer's capacity to labor belongs to capital, and the capitalist wants to exploit it to maximum degree. Inter-capitalist competition and the coercive laws of competition force individual capitalists to extend the working day as long as possible, no matter what individual capitalists might think appropriate. If I'm in competition with other entrepreneurs who are having people work 12-hour working days and I have a 6-hour working day, I will not last in competition very long. The worker likewise has the right to resist when the hours worked and the intensity of the labor becomes so onerous as to threaten the worker's health and longevity. Between these two equal rights, Marx famously observes, force decides. Force is not simply physical force, it is, of course, political force, political power. Class struggle ensues. At some point, the state is obliged to intervene to regulate the length of the working day in the interest of both labor and capital. Capital's interest is not generally served, after all, by killing off workers through overwork, or so exhausting and diminishing them as to lower their productivity. This is what the unlimited operation of the coercive laws of competition will likely produce. With the help of the reports of the factory inspectors, Marx presents an overview of working conditions in Britain during his time, culminating in the case of Mary Ann Walkley, and I quote, 20 years old, employed in highly respectable dressmaking establishment, where girls work on average 16.5 hours without a break per day during the season, often 30 hours. And the flow of the failing labor power is maintained by occasional supplies of sherry, port, or coffee. Walkley quite simply died from overwork, the factory inspectors reported. The same fate befell many African Americans in the wake of the emancipation from slavery in the United States. Using incarceration for the most minor of offenses and prison labor organized by the state, a new form of wage slavery was introduced in the US southern states, in which death from overwork or from indiscipline was an acceptable practice. Death from overwork is still a formal cause of death, though not so widespread in Japan, China, and some sectors like the Thai fishing industry. Employees in Jack Ma's Alibaba worked on a schedule from 9 in the morning until 9 at night for 6 days a week. In response to widespread complaints and resistance to this infamous 996 system, Jack Ma merely stated that the workers should be grateful that they have a job and feel proud to contribute to the economic power of China through their hard work. He neglected to say that by this extraction of absolute surplus value, he had become one of the richest persons in the world. The Communist Party has now stepped in and outlawed the 996 system. They have also designated the province where Alibaba is headquartered as an experimental common prosperity zone in which Ma, along with other billionaires, have been invited to put much of their immense personal fortunes to the achievement of a common prosperity of all. Ma has largely disappeared from public view, and his donations are managed by party officials and not by NGOs under his control. The extraction of absolute surplus value in China is currently being curbed by political intervention. In Marx's time, significant legislation to regulate the length of the working day was introduced in Britain, partly because the working class became more organized and powerful, but also through an alliance, Marx tells us, with class factions that had no direct interest in the question. In a parliament where the landed interest and aristocracy still had a great deal of power, legislation against the interests of the loathsome industrial capitalists was entirely feasible. The laborer's experience of capital is not, however, confined to the workplace, and it is here that the circulation of labor capacity calls for broader examination. The working person is exposed to radically different material experiences in the course of the circulation of labor capacity. As seller of labor capacity in a competitive labor market, as participant in a labor process designed and commanded by capital, as recipient of a wage, which confers the discretionary freedom that goes with money power, as buyer of commodities in the market, both necessities in order to live and discretionary, and finally as participant in and product of the multiple forms of social reproduction, including socialized provision in the daily life of a household, however defined in a physical neighborhood. Diverse experiences across these different moments in this circulation process tend to generate different political subjectivities. If the identity of working persons as workers is, as, and I quote Marx on this, extinguished when they purchase commodities in the market and they assume the identity of buyers, then how can class consciousness be articulated, let alone sustained, across all the moments within the circulation process? The different political subjectivities that attach to the different moments tend to disguise the overall class character of the capitalist mode of production. It is only from the perspective of capital's totality that the class character becomes clearly visible. And it is for this reason that cultivating the perspective of capital as a totality is so important, and why abandoning the perspective of the totality has been so politically damaging. In practice, working persons typically relate differently to the different experiential worlds they encounter. Some workers might succumb to the temptation of a compensatory consumerism, in which they are offered access to a cornucopia of cheap consumer goods as compensation for horrific alienations at the point of production. Others may reluctantly consent to the alienation of their labor and general exploitation in the hope that they may be able to put sufficient money by to someday open a bodega or a coffee shop. Yet others may consent to everything in this circulation process, provided they have time and money enough to create for themselves a meaningful family or household life. Taking the kids to little league soccer games or music classes is just romping with them in the backyard may afford enough pride and pleasure to mask the miserable, alienating experience of working for capital and going to the shopping mall. The creation of a solidarious and amicable neighborhood life has been for many working class populations a compensatory, though not unproblematic joy that makes class struggles against capital and production seem a remote and even unnecessary engagement. Many of the active struggles we are now witnessing are over such matters as exploitation in the marketplace, protests against monopoly power and price gouging of pharmaceutical products, or housing rents, for example. The perversions of the credit and mortgage debt system, consumer and credit card debt, the qualities of social provision in the state sector, the qualities of daily life. Workers' struggles against capital in the workplace are just one form of struggle, and by no means always the most immediately important, eye-catching, or feasible. The deterioration of the qualities of neighborhood life and stresses within families or household reproduction units, much of which can be traced back to deindustrialization, unemployment, and the political turn to neoliberalism, now lies at the root of much of the political malaise experienced by many working people in the United States. The production of a vibrant and unsatisfying daily life is for many working persons just as important as holding a satisfying and well-remunerated job. The ideal, of course, is to achieve both. But such a privileged, affluent worker is harder to find in these neoliberal times. Some professional positions are, however, sufficiently well remunerated to allow for such a life. Like all the other circulation processes that work within the totality, we have to recognize the contextual forces unleashed by capital that affect the circulation of labor capacity. Environmental pollution and degradation, much of it due to capital treating the environment as an externality for which capitalists are not responsible, have impacts upon health, life expectancy, and capacity to labor on an unequal basis. Public education is contingent on the uneven circulation of tax revenues, and consumer habits are very much driven by the creation of new wants and needs like cell phones at the behest of capital. Workers' savings are likewise subject to devaluation in the course of a financial crisis, while collapse of energy networks and hurricane and tornado damage all affect unevenly and sometimes devastatingly the circulation process. It is in the sphere of social reproduction that older cultural relations of laboring, of patriarchy and gender dominance are both preserved and enhanced with major consequences for employment structures and economic inequality. It is here too that discussions over sexuality and reproduction are centered, again with consequences elsewhere for the circulation of labor capacity. I suspect that Marx's purpose, however, is to offer a framework in which working persons might reflect upon their situation and come to terms with all of the forces that condemn them to conditions of living and working that are, to say the least, so inadequate and oppressive to them, while being thoroughly adequate, of course, to capital, as to conjure up the prospect of revolt. It is almost as if Marx plans to invite working persons to join with him in dissecting the body of their discontents in the circulation process of capital, of labor. by reviewing the totality of the experience within the circulation of labour capacity. But there is a problem. How do workers become political subjects and class-conscious beings when their experience within the circulation of capital are so fragmented? Marx indicates where the hope might lie, and he suggests this for all of us, that we should think in the following terms. And I quote from him: "The concrete totality is a totality of thoughts, a product of thinking and comprehending, of the working up of observation and conception into concepts. The totality as it appears in the head, as a totality of thoughts, as a product of a thinking head, which appropriates the world in the only way it can, even as the real subject, society, retains its autonomous existence outside the head, just as before. Only in this way can working persons see their lives as a rich totality of many determinations and relations, while fully recognizing the material condition that the concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse. From the standpoint of the labourer, embedded in the circulation of labour capacity, their crisis is more or less chronic: low wages, alienation, impoverishment, unemployment, insecurity, low living standards, etc. What is adequate for capital is inadequate for labour. One thrives at the expense of the other. Not that there are not places and times when the lot of the working class has been more acceptable and stable. Now, there are a number of deeper points to be made about the conditions that attach to each of the 5 moments within the circulation of labour capacity. For example, the competition in labour markets is often fierce and pits not only worker against worker, but also frequently internalizes hostilities between different factions based on gender, ethnicity, race, religion, or simply provenance. These differences often date back to pre-existing rivalries between social groups. To the degree that capital benefits from such competitive factionalism, it and its dominant instruments in the media undoubtedly do their level best to continue, promote, or even create segmented labour markets to hold back the possibility of class solidarity among all wage workers as they attempt to negotiate an adequate wage and organise a livable life. The greater the heterogeneity and diversity of the labour force, the harder it is to organise labour along class lines to assure fair treatment in the labour market. The relative homogeneity of the labour forces in Scandinavia after 1945 played an important role in facilitating strong adherence to social democratic norms relative to the United States with its factionalized immigrant labour force. The resultant wage, the value of labour power, is thus dependent, unlike all other commodities, on the outcome of class formation and class struggles and class factionalisms. The nature of the skills required to facilitate a labour process is sensitive to the technology deployed. A struggle ensues over the capacity for sections of the labour force to monopolise skills and thereby command a higher wage. The whole history of technological evolution carries within it the attempt by capital to combat the potential monopolisation of skills by initiating technologies that disempower labour. The advent of artificial intelligence appears in this regard to be as threatening to service provision as automation was for manufacturing. But the systems set up to disempower labour are all too often entailing the definition of new monopolisable skills. The result is often a hierarchy of skills to which corresponds a hierarchy of wages, thus segmenting the workforce along technical as opposed to cultural and social lines. It is not hard to take each of the moments within the circulation of labour capacity and elaborate in this way on the diverse conditions under which the moment will be experienced. Early on in the history of British capitalism, for example, workers set up mutual and aid societies and penny savings banks to attempt to put by monies to insure against sickness, accidents, or the vicissitudes of old age. These were the precursors to modern structures of social security and insurance, while facilities for workers to save or even borrow have multiplied. Examples include the introduction of microcredit, the anti-capitalist Grameen Bank set up by Yunus in Bangladesh, superseded by a proliferation of Washington-based microfinance programs that sought to support impoverished populations pursuing an entrepreneurialism of the self on pro-capitalist terms in emerging markets. The billions of people living on less than $2 a day formed a huge market that cried out to be tapped by the financiers, it was said. Many of the active struggles we are now witnessing are over such matters as exploitation in the market, protests against monopoly power and price gouging, housing rents, the perversions of the credit and mortgage debt system, the qualities of social provision in the state sector, the qualities of daily life. Workplace struggles against capital and production are just one form of many class and other social struggles. The deterioration of the qualities of neighborhood life and stresses within households over adequate provision can be immediate locus of distress. The production of a vibrant and satisfying daily life is, for many working persons, just as important as holding satisfying and well remunerated job. In the Grundrisse, Marx on occasion appeals to a mythical figure, and I'm going to do this frequently in what follows. This figure is called the emancipated laborer. In order to ask how do laborers, armed with the kind of knowledge we are here presenting, how might they react and strategize with the aim of improving their lot and exploring alternatives? Individuals enclosed within the circulation process can obviously seek to minimize their alienation, oppression, and open spaces in which they can flourish. Collectively, they can organize to monopolize their position in labor markets and labor processes, as some immigrant groups have in the past become skilled at doing. Or they can mobilize state powers to create a labor market as free as possible of all forms of discrimination on the grounds of race, gender, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, and the like. State regulation of labor processes to ensure occupational health and safety, institutional support for pension rights, health insurance, access to free education and the like, cooperative supply of food and housing, and of course, adequate infrastructural investments to ensure a good quality of life for households are some of the social democratic platforms that could be presented politically to bring an aura of greater civility to the circulation of labor capacity from the perspective of the totality. The consequence of Marx's framing of the circulating of labor capacities as a key circulation process within the forming of capital's totality is that it highlights what so many people have in common in their daily activities of working and living, without in any way denying the radical diversity of their skills, their individual capacities, their cultural backgrounds, and all the other phenomena they bring to this process, but which tend to divide, diversify, and fragment political consciousness. Marx had, however, the long-term ambition for the abolition of wage labor altogether and the collapse of the circulation of labor capacity as one of the primary supports for the capitalist mode of production. Hints of this can be seen in what is called the Great Resignation that followed the disruption of labor markets and employment due to COVID-19. A significant segment of the labor force did not come back into the labor markets and refused to be reinscribed in the circulation of labor capacities. Some, mainly women, could not do so because of child-rearing obligations, in which case the organization of household labor substitutes for the circulation of labor capacity. Others emphasize their alienation or refuse to return given their history as recipients of abusive and excessive exploitation. They have found other modes of employment, odd jobs, and non-pecuniary means of social provision. Marx's dream, however, was that the associated laborers would find collective ways to organize social production cooperatively and hence abolish the power of the class relation over daily life. How that might be done with the help of automation and the artificial intelligence has not yet been seriously considered. From the standpoint of the emancipated laborer, the superiority of good social democratic management over neoliberal unbenign neglect is obvious. But that in Marx's book is only an intermediate step towards an even more emancipatory possibility. Sorry, a bit long that, but on the other hand, I wanted to make clear But when we start to talk about the circulation of labor capacity, we are talking about diversity of experiences. And it seems to me absolutely critical politically to actually use the concept of totality in the head to encompass all of those different moments and say, let's look at this as a whole. Let's look at the totality and let's talk about not just simply the reconstruction of life in the workplace or life in social reproduction or in the marketplace, all of which are important. But let's look at it as a whole, as a totality, and talk about how that then could be substituted by something else. Now, this is the first step I'm taking here about getting inside of the totality and what goes on. And obviously, you could write a whole book about the circulation of labor capacity. I'm trying to summarize what seem to me some of the main elements, and you may have many different ideas about it. But this is, for me, then, a very important step, that we start with the concept of the totality, and then we disaggregate it and look at the different circulation processes. And from the standpoint of those different circulation processes, try to come up with some sort of politics, some sort of political understanding, and also a better way of using the concept of totality, not simply to understand what's going on out there, but to understand the concept of totality in relation to what is going on inside here, as it were. So maybe if anybody got any comments they want to make about this, any question marks. I'm putting this text on the web. I hope you'll be able to read it at your leisure, and then we come back and discuss it further next week. But are there any immediate responses, reactions that people want to make?
I have a question just to clarify one of the terms. So when Marx refers to capacity, he's speaking about, I think you said, knowledge of labor processes. Is that right? Is that the definition, or is there anything else involved when he's talking about capacity?
No, it's the capacity of the laborer to work. Now, depending upon the technology, obviously that capacity must entail certain skills, certain minimum skills these days, like literacy, for example. I mean, Marx's time, about 3/4 of the working population was illiterate. And it's very difficult to imagine labor processes today that wouldn't require a certain standard of literacy on the part of the workers. You know, got to read instructions and understand instructions, and know what it means. So yes, the capacity to labor is something that is all of those things, and there are capacities that the laborer has which sometimes remain untapped. And you find this in you find workers in plants saying, God, they can make this plant work much more efficiently if only the boss would listen to them, kind of thing. So you find the laborer is actually aware and thinking about, and having the capacity to do that is terribly important within contemporary capitalism in ways that it was not in Marx's day. Like I said, proletariat in Marx's day was 70% illiterate. The 30% that was literate was astonishingly literate. So you have this duality. And Marx is mainly talking to the literate group, but at a certain point, the question is, how do you inform the illiterate group?
I've got a question, David, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So you were talking about kind of different sides of struggle beyond the workplace. So also in the context of, social reproduction. So there are struggles around social reproduction not falling purely on the worker, but being funded or subsidized by the state, or maybe even by capital. Maybe there are struggles in terms of in the market, value doesn't get realized until people start consuming or whatever. But it seems to me as if there's a hierarchy in that totality between production, consumption, and realization, the main site of struggle is production, because or am I not? Is that too much of a broad generalization? Because Marx is wanting the kind of collapse of wage labor, and struggles around consumption, like consume less, or struggles around social reproduction don't affect the relationship between capital and labor. It may affect it in terms of distribution of surplus value, for example, with higher wages, or with part of that surplus value being used to subsidize workers' housing or education or whatever. But it doesn't hit the kind of relationship between capital's ability to expropriate that surplus value. So does Marx infer a hierarchy in that totality between production, circulation, and realization?
I tend to not go with that formulation. I tend to kind of say I want to get away from a hierarchy. There are certain things that happen at certain moments which are critical for the reproduction of the system. The moment of production is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But as Marx says, if you can't sell the product, it's not value. So if you can't realize it, it's not value. So it becomes socially unnecessary labor time. So I want to get away from the idea that somehow or other there's production, because capital is also very, very slick about it. I mean, the sort of thing that bothers me about contemporary politics even. Now, there's a great deal of agitation these days about, increasing the living wage, increasing the minimum wage. It's $15, $15. And yeah, I support it. But what's the point of getting a $15 wage as opposed to a $7 wage when your housing rents double? Okay. So what the bourgeoisie does is says, well, if capital concedes something at the point of production, we can get it back at the point of consumption.
Mm.
Okay. So this idea that the only place where there is appropriation of surplus value occurs in the production process, that's wrong. The appropriation can occur various other places. And so that's why the perspective of the totality comes in. And the analogy I crudely used, which gets people very annoyed, is kind of say, well, there's a certain sense in which we all die of heart attacks because our heart stops. But if I go into hospital and I've got something wrong with me, whether I go up to a cardiologist or a pulmonary expert or whatever, or a urologist or whatever, you want to go where the problem is. And I think the circulation of labor capacity is very much like that. That yes, there's a point which is critical for the worker, which is that point of where they're engaging in production, because that's where they produce the surplus value. That's clear. Yeah, but what are the conditions which allow capital to then recuperate? And actually, right now, if you look at who's doing best in the economy, it's not the producers of things. It's people like Blackstones who are buying up housing and renting them out, So that's where the main appropriation is going on right now. And you would kind of say, well, what's the point of having a slightly less working day and a much better wage if you've got to pay twice as much for your rent? So one of the things you start to see when you're thinking about the circulation of labor capacity is all those moments can compensate for each other. They can all, and capital is active. I mean, how much did capital persuade people to buy housing in the run up to 2007, 2008, and how much did people lose from foreclosure on their housing? This was a huge loss. Now, you can kind of say it was a huge loss, particularly concentrated, of course, amongst African-American populations and Hispanic populations, but you kind of say, well, what would you rather have? Given a reasonable amount of money so that you can buy a house that is then foreclosed upon, what? So thinking about the totality is important. Now, I don't want to get into a situation of saying I'm diminishing in any way the significance of saying, well, the place where surplus value is produced and created is in the production process. Yes. The place where it's appropriated will be somewhere else. Who appropriates it and how it's appropriated and how capitalists can compensate by raising wages and then having inflation. I mean, the period in the 1960s was very interesting because the big corporations started to pay higher wages and better living conditions. And you find somebody called the affluent worker, who's the auto worker who's, sitting there in a suburban house with 2 television sets and a car in the driveway and all those kinds of, fairly affluent kind of worker. But at the same time, the prices of all those things were going up. And so at that point, the unions started to come in, introducing COLAs, that is cost of living adjustments into contracts, because they saw that for every raise they got in the wage market, it was recouped back by rising prices. So they weren't going anywhere. And so these are the kinds of things that are there. And I think what good social democratic politics was about was kind of saying, well, you have to have interventions at all of these across this whole thing. That is, we want to have free schooling. We want to have good social housing, which is cheap. And we have to set that up. So we have to have decent health care. We have to have, OSHA has to, occupational safety and health people have to be there, making sure that there's no danger in the workplace. All of those things have to be in. So if you look at a well-engineered social democratic society, which is not what Marx was looking for in the end, like I mentioned, he was looking for the abolition of the whole system. But you can imagine doing it in such a way that it becomes much more civilized, as I put it in the paper. You could get a kind of civilized version of this at certain historical times, and you could argue that in the 1960s it was closer to being a civilized version of this for certain groups in the population, not for everyone. But nowadays we've gone backwards, and it's pretty bad for everybody, unless you happen to be outside of in a semi-professional way. But we'll come back to this again. This gets me into trouble because a lot of people kind of say I'm anti the production bias there is in Marxist thinking, and to some degree I am against that. But I certainly will not going to deny that it's foundational. But to recognize that that all these other elements have to be understood in relation to each other, and I don't want to say there's a hierarchy of importance, that one is more important than the other. They are part of a system. It's the system that's the problem, not that one thing. Okay, it seems to me we're about pretty much out of time, unless anybody has any immediate questions. Anything?
No, that's great. Thank you so much, David, and everyone in class, and everyone on the live stream. These materials will be available on davidharvey.org. I'm going to end the live stream now, and we can keep on